Hey guys, welcome back to the next step of this white oak mantle. We already ran this mantle through the joiner, as you saw in the previous video, to get all the surfaces nice and flat and the edges square. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to mix up some epoxy and fill in all these checks. Hope you enjoy. Ooh, that's hard wood.
Good when I'm winning, it makes me want to win more. I'm addicted to victory, I'm a junkie when I score. I feel good when I'm winning, it makes me hammer down. Blasting past the haters, I'm the king of this town.
So one of the things before we start pouring the epoxy is a little bit of prep work. We haven't cut this mantle to the final length. And the reason being is, as you notice, some of these checks go all the way to the end grain here. And so what I like to do is I like to tape up these ends so I can pour the epoxy so it goes all the way to the end, and then everything is filled, so we take the saw and then cut it to the final length, and everything is filled all the way through. What I like to do is it's really important to leave the tape up just a little bit so the epoxy can run all the way up to the tape, doesn't pour over the edge, and you end up losing or wasting a bunch of it. So the first thing you got to do is you got to get the epoxy to the right temperature, between about 70 to 80 degrees. But the best way that I've found to do that out here is to actually put this in a warm water bath. And we just submerge the water up to the line of the epoxy that's in the container. These are getting just about empty, so obviously there's not that much water inside. This particular type of epoxy is Promise epoxy. This is a two-part epoxy, meaning it's a 50-50 mix. So equal parts to each, and then you mix them up. But the reason why you want to heat this epoxy up is it just helps it mix better, number one, and then as you mix it, you get a lot less air. When the epoxy is a cooler temperature, you get a lot of air, that's bubbles that start to form as you're mixing it. Well, we got the epoxy to temperature, so I'm just going to dry these off. You definitely don't want to get any water to drip inside your container as you're pouring it. This is part A, and I want to make about 8 ounces total. So I'm going to pour this first one to 4. All right, now here's part B. And add 4 more ounces to that to 8. Good? Yeah. As you can see there, we got both parts in there. I just take a small, like, tongue depressor wooden stick, and that's what I use with this small batch to start to mix it. One of the things that I use to make sure the temperature is right is this little heat gun. So I'll shoot inside the epoxy. So as you can see there, it's right around 77, 78 degrees. You typically want to mix the epoxy for, on average, right around 5 to 8 minutes. When it starts out, you can tell it's kind of cloudy, but there's hardly any bubbles that are forming, and that's because it's at the right temperature. But as it starts to become mixed and mixed together really, really well, this will all clear out. All right, well, so it's been about 6-7 minutes of continuous stirring. Not really fast, just kind of nice and slow. You make sure you want to get all the edges and get everything stirred up all the way through the bottom. As you can tell, now this is really cleared up, has very minimal bubbles in it, again, due to the correct temperature. This mantle is actually going to be stained, and so when we go through and fill in all these checks, what I like to do is actually tint the epoxy with the actual stain color. In this case, this is a general stain finish, and the color is Java. And so I want to add a little bit of that stain color into this epoxy. If you don't, oftentimes what will happen is this stuff will dry crystal clear, and when you do that and don't stain it, the light color of the wood will kind of flash through. It'll be just like glass looking through there, and it usually doesn't come out right. So I'm going to add a little bit of this Java stain to the epoxy. Doesn't take much, just a little bit. I'll go ahead and start mixing that in for a couple minutes or until I can tell it's mixed all the way through. So this is the underside of the mantle that actually I started filling these in earlier this week. As you can tell, these checks on the bottom side are a lot wider and a lot deeper. This is actually 3 pours to get it to this stage. And the reason for doing that is that you typically don't want to pour this 2-part epoxy any thicker than 1 inch to about 1.5 inches. What ends up happening is it creates too much heat as it's trying to cure and set up, and it can actually crack out and then not give you a good product. Now this just needs to sit for 72 hours before it completely hardens so we can start sanding it. All right, well, now we got the epoxy mixed up and the epoxy with the stain all mixed up. Once everything is mixed up, you have about 15 to 20 minutes working time before the epoxy actually kind of starts to set up a little bit in the cup. So if you use like a 3-part epoxy or a 2 to 3 epoxy, you obviously have a little bit more time for it to, before it starts to set up. It's not that big a deal if you're pouring more than what the check needs, but oftentimes it takes 1 to 2 to sometimes 3 different pours to get everything nice and full. As the epoxy sets up and dries, the wood actually absorbs some of it, and so you can fill it up and it looks like you're going to be good, but then you'll come back in the morning and some of it has shrunk down in. So then you just got to go back through and touch up. As you can tell, that one there is taking quite a bit of epoxy. Well, I just finished putting all the epoxy in. As you can tell, I'm going to have to come back and re-pour several of these areas. Some of these are actually obviously pretty deep. But the next step is actually I use a heat gun. And what this does is if there's any bubbles that form, it actually pops them and releases the epoxy, so it kind of helps lay down flat. So what I like to do is I just like to go over the epoxy a little bit, heats it back up, kind of has a tendency to let it kind of lay down nice and flat again, and just to release any of the little air pockets that might be in there. But I'll let this sit for at least 24 hours before I come back and do another pour. Well guys, that's the general overview on how I fill these voids and checks in these mantles. Sometimes I'll leave the epoxy clear. Obviously in this case I went ahead and tinted it to the customer's stain color, and it'll just kind of help it blend in as we start to stain it. Next time we'll end up cutting this to length, prepping it for the bracket, and also starting doing the final sanding to get it ready for stain. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys maybe learned something, and at the very least entertained. Until then, we'll catch you on the next one.